Losing everything you've built isn't just painful, it strips away who you thought you were. Grace Hartley learned this truth at 52 when her
This looks
ex-husband took
important.
the
We need to
architecture
document this
firm she'd
carefully.
spent 15 years building, the Victorian house in Omaha's Dundee neighborhood, and $340,000 she hadn't known were already gone. What he left her fit inside a 12-year-old Honda CR-V, drafting tools that couldn't pay rent, $11,000 that wouldn't last 2 months, and a 16-year-old daughter who looked at her like a stranger she was obligated to tolerate. Desperation has an address. For Grace, it was a Walmart parking lot at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep on the CRV's back seat while scrolling through real estate forums on a phone with 6% battery. That's when she found the listing someone had posted almost as a joke: historic Kansas ranch, as is $1 plus assumption of back taxes. The photograph showed a house surrendering to gravity, a barn collapsed into its own skeleton, fence posts tilted like broken teeth. But Grace saw structure beneath the decay, problems that had solutions if someone cared enough to work. The back taxes totaled $8,200. Grace had exactly $11,000 left. It would clean her out, leave her with nothing for mistakes or emergencies or second chances. But sleeping in a car wasn't living, it was just waiting to disappear. She called the county clerk the next morning. The woman's voice carried surprise that anyone had responded to a listing 20 years cold. "Ma'am, I should tell you that property's in rough condition. Been abandoned near 2 decades. No utilities. Well's probably dry. Septic's anyone's guess." Grace's hands tightened on the phone. "I can fix things. That's what I do." A pause stretched across the line. "It's pretty isolated. Nearest town is 40 minutes. Not much out there but wind and prairie." "That's fine. Well, if you're certain, we can have paperwork ready by end of week." Telling Emma was harder than signing the divorce papers had been. They met at a Panera because David had insisted on neutral territory, which meant anywhere Grace couldn't make a scene. Her daughter walked in looking taller than Grace remembered. Harder somehow. The softness of childhood burned away by 6 months of watching her parents destroy each other through lawyers. Grace waited until they had ordered, then spoke the words she'd practiced a dozen times driving over. "I'm moving to Kansas. I bought a ranch." Emma's face went blank in that way teenagers perfect when they've stopped expecting parents to make sense. "You're what?" "It needs work, but it's a fresh start. For both of us." "Both?" Emma's laugh came out sharp enough to cut. "I'm not going anywhere." "You'd have your own room. There's a school in the county seat." "Are you serious? You want me to leave my friends, my school, my entire life to go live in the middle of nowhere with you in some dump that probably doesn't even have Wi-Fi?" Grace absorbed the contempt, let it settle into the collection of failures she'd been carrying. "It'll have internet, and it's a chance for us to—" "No," Emma stood, chair squarey. Other diners turned. "I'm staying with Dad. At least he has his life together." But David, in a move Grace still didn't understand, had called 2 days later with words she hadn't expected. "She can go." Grace's breath caught. "Why?" Silence on the line suggested calculations being made, strategies being weighed. "Because she's angry at both of us right now. Maybe watching you try something new will teach her something I can't." A pause. "Or maybe seeing you fail from a distance will make her appreciate what I've given her." Either way, Emma came, furious and resentful, carrying 2 suitcases and the kind of silence that made clear she was marking time until escape became possible. The drive from Omaha took 6 hours through landscape that flattened into endless horizon. Grace tried conversation for the first 100 miles, pointing out landmarks, mentioning the town they'd be near, talking through plans for making the property livable. Emma responded with grunts and phone scrolling, her screen a barrier between them more effective than any wall. By the third hour, Grace gave up, letting the prairie roll past in silence, broken only by the CRV's engine and wind buffeting the windows. When they finally pulled onto the property, Emma's first words in 100 miles confirmed what Grace already knew. "You've got to be kidding me." The house looked worse than the photographs. Sun-bleached wood showed through paint that had surrendered years ago. The porch sagged under its own weight. Windows gaped empty where glass should have been. The barn had given up entirely, its frame exposed like ribs picked clean. Tumbleweeds claimed the yard in drifts that reached the porch steps. Grace killed the engine, hands still gripping the steering wheel. It needs work. It needs a bulldozer. Emma's voice carried the kind of contempt only teenagers can weaponize. This is what you spent our money on? It's what I could afford. Then maybe you should have stayed in the car. Grace let that land without responding. She'd earned her daughter's anger through years of small surrenders, trusting David with the business finances, putting the house in his name, believing marriage meant partnership instead of watching someone plan your destruction from inside your own life. The divorce had been surgical, David's lawyer dissecting Grace's world with documentation that proved David had been preparing this for years. The firm was in his name. The house was in his name. The savings had migrated to accounts Grace couldn't touch. Even Emma's custody had been calculated. David's home deemed more stable, his income more reliable, his life more together. What Grace kept fit in a car, what she'd lost would take a lifetime to rebuild. They moved in anyway because nowhere else existed. Grace hauled debris from what would be Emma's bedroom for 3 hours. Broken furniture, mouse nests, decades of accumulated failure. She scrubbed surfaces until they were safe if not clean, set up a thrift store bed frame, helped Emma unpack while her daughter radiated fury without speaking. Grace's own room was smaller, just space for a cot and her tools. She spent that first night lying awake, listening to the house settle and creak, wondering if she'd made a catastrophic mistake or the first right decision in years. The neighbor appeared the next morning like a ghost materializing from prairie grass. Grace was surveying the barn's remains when movement at the property line caught her eye. A small figure, bent with age but moving with purpose. The woman stopped at the boundary, waiting. Grace walked over, hand extended. Grace Hartley, I just bought this place. Martha Sykes. The handshake was brief, the woman's skin paper-thin over bone. Live a mile east. Martha's eyes tracked across the property, and something moved in her face. Pain or memory or recognition of loss. Used to be something fine here. Shame what happened. You knew the previous owners? Long time ago. Martha's gaze lingered on the house. Before it all went wrong. Grace waited, but the woman offered nothing more. After a moment, Martha turned those sharp eyes on her, studying Grace with unsettling intensity. What brings a woman all the way out here for $1 in prayers? Fresh start. Martha nodded slowly, but her expression suggested she heard the desperation underneath. Sometimes that's what a place offers. She turned to leave, then paused. Word of advice, Miss Hartley. If you start finding things, old things, might be best to let them stay lost. Some history is better left buried. The warning hung in the air between them. Grace wanted to ask what history, what things, but Martha was already walking away, moving faster than her age should allow. 30 minutes later, a new Silverado pulled up the driveway, chrome gleaming in afternoon sun that made the ranch's decay look even worse. The man who stepped out wore designer ranch casual, jeans that cost more than Grace's weekly grocery budget, boots that had never seen mud. Silver touched his temples in a way that looked distinguished on men and invisible on women. His smile didn't reach his eyes. You must be the new owner. He extended a hand. Cole Miller. I own the bank in town, and most of the businesses around here. Grace didn't take the offered hand. Grace Hartley. Cole's smile tightened fractionally. I heard someone actually bought this dump. Thought it was a joke. He looked at the house with contempt so casual it must have been practiced. This place has been cursed for 70 years. Everyone who tries to fix it fails. Grace kept her voice level. I'm good at fixing things. I'll save you the trouble. Yeah. Cole pulled a checkbook from his pocket. I'll give you $15,000 right now. That's $7,000 profit for doing nothing. Take it and find somewhere else to start over. The offer came too fast, too smooth, rehearsed. Grace's architect training kicked in. When someone pushed this hard, they were hiding structural problems. Why do you want it so badly? Something flickered behind Cole's eyes, calculation, maybe fear, before the mask returned. I don't want it. I'm being neighborly. This property has complicated history, best left alone. I'm not interested in selling. Cole's expression hardened. friendliness dropping away like a costume change. Miss Hartley, I don't think you understand how things work in this county. I control the credit, the permits, the suppliers. Making a life here requires cooperation. He leaned closer. And I don't cooperate with stubborn people who don't know when to quit. Grace held her ground. Thanks for stop on, guy. Now get off my property. Cole studied her for a long moment, then smiled. Not friendly, but satisfied, like he'd just confirmed something he had suspected. He climbed into the Silverado, rolled down the window. You'll regret this. That house has secrets that should stay buried, and people who dig them up tend to have accidents. The truck kicked up dust as it accelerated away. Grace stood watching until it disappeared, heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been threatened by David's lawyer with legal language designed to intimidate. This was different, simpler, more dangerous. Emma emerged from the house, face pale. Mom, that guy's scary. Yeah, Grace looked back at the property, seeing it with new eyes, which means this place is worth more than $1. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Grace looked up to see clouds gathering, dark and fast-moving. In that way, Kansas storms announced themselves. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in minutes. Wind picked up, bending the prairie grass in waves. They barely made it inside before the storm broke. Rain hammered the roof in a roar that made conversation impossible. Lightning illuminated gaps where shingles had surrendered, showing Grace all the work that lay ahead. The power had been shut off years ago, leaving them in darkness except for what the storm provided. Grace found candles in her toolkit, lit them in the kitchen, where their glow pushed back shadows without quite defeating them. Emma sat at the table, phone clutched like a talisman, but out here there was no signal. For the first time in months, her daughter had no choice but to be present. We can't stay here. Emma's voice carried fear beneath the anger. That man, Cole whatever, he threatened you. He did, Grace sat across from her. Which means we're onto something. People don't threaten strangers unless those strangers are close to something they want kept hidden. Or he's just crazy and we should leave before he comes back. Grace thought about the 11,000 she'd started with, now down to less than 3 after the purchase and drive out. Thought about David's lawyer, who'd made her feel small and stupid for trusting the wrong person. Thought about 6 months sleeping in a car, invisible and defeated. I've run enough, from the divorce, from the business, from Omaha. I'm done running. Emma looked at her mother like she was seeing someone new. You're serious. You're actually going to stay here and fight some rich guy who owns half the county. I'm going to figure out why he wants this property so badly, and then I'm going to make sure he doesn't get it. The storm provided cover for exploration. Grace had been meaning to clear the root cellar anyway. It would make decent storage once cleaned out. Now seemed as good a time as any. The cellar accessed through a trap door in the kitchen floor, steps descending into darkness that the candles barely touched. Emma followed without being asked, and Grace took that as progress. 70 years of abandonment had turned the space into layers of decay, mouse nests in corners, spider webs draped like torn curtains, debris piled against walls. But beneath it all, Grace saw good bones, limestone foundation hand-fitted by someone who'd cared about their work. Original beams still solid despite the years. They worked in silence, hauling debris up in wheelbarrow loads Grace had bought at a Goodwill in Omaha. The physical labor felt good after months of helplessness, sweat earning something tangible instead of just trying to survive one more day. Around midnight, with the storm still raging, Grace found the trap door. It was set into the floor near the back wall, covered by decades of dirt and mouse droppings. She almost missed it. Would have, except the floorboards around it sat slightly warped, creating a depression that caught her eye. Emma held the candle while Grace worked the boards free. Beneath them, an iron trap door set flush with the foundation. Rust had claimed the corners, but the seal remained intact. Someone had closed this carefully, deliberately, wanting whatever lay below protected. Grace pried it open. The hinges screamed protest loud enough to cut through the storm. Inside, an iron lockbox, heavy with age and secrets. On the lid, stamped into the metal, Miller Construction, 1953. Emma leaned closer, candlelight dancing across the lettering. Miller. Like that creepy guy who came today? Grace lifted the box, felt its weight in her hands. 70 years sealed, waiting. She carried it up into the kitchen, set it on the table they'd salvaged from a trash heap. Emma stood beside her, phone forgotten, focused on this mystery in a way she hadn't focused on anything since the divorce. The lock had rusted shut. Grace worked it with a screwdriver, careful not to damage what might be inside. When it finally gave, the lid opened with a sea-like released breath. The contents spread across the table told a story Grace didn't yet understand but recognized. Another person's life preserved, another person's dreams interrupted. A leather journal, pages yellowed and fragile. Photographs faded to sepia showing faces she didn't know. Military medals still bright despite the years. Legal documents creased from repeated folding. And beneath it all, letters tied with twine. Grace opened the journal carefully, aware she was holding someone's voice from 7 decades past. The first page in careful script, property of Samuel Garrett, 1952. Emma pulled one of the photographs closer. A young man in the WW2 uniform, serious expression, strong jaw. Another photo showed the same man older, standing beside a woman with kind eyes. A third showed them together in front of this house, but not the ruin Grace had bought. This house stood proud and new, paint fresh, porch straight, a home instead of a grave. Who were they? Emma's voice had lost its edge, replaced by something Grace hadn't heard in months. Curiosity. Grace read the first journal entry aloud, the storm providing percussion to words written when Eisenhower was president. March 15, 1952. Started the partnership with Jacob today. Signed the papers in town. Split everything 50-50 like we agreed. Jacob says we're going to build an empire out here. Says the land has potential most folks can't see. I believe him. He's got vision, that one. Together we're going to make this ranch something special. The optimism in those words hurt to read. Grace recognized the tone. She'd felt that way once, starting the architecture firm with David, believing hard work and fair dealing were enough. She flipped through more pages, watching the tone shift. The entries grew darker, optimism curdling into concern. June 1952. Jacob's been taking trips to the city, says he's meeting investors, setting up sales channels. Won't give me much detail. Says I should trust him on the business end while I focus on the ranch work. September 1952. Found discrepancies in the cattle count. Jacob says it's just sloppy record keeping, but I counted twice. We're short at least 20 head from what the books show. March 1953. Confronted Jacob about the missing cattle. He got angry, said I was questioning his integrity. Maybe I am, but something's not right. Money's going out that doesn't match what's coming in. Grace looked up. Emma was reading over her shoulder now, close enough that Grace could feel her daughter's breath. Keep going, Emma whispered. Grace turned pages, following Samuel Garrett's slow realization that he'd trusted the wrong person. The handwriting grew more urgent, entries more frequent. June 1953. I have proof now. Financial records showing where the money went. Jacob's been stealing from our partnership since day one. The final entry stopped Grace cold. October 12, 1953. Tomorrow I confront Jacob with everything I found. I have the proof now, documentation he can't explain away. If he won't make this right, I'll take it to the authorities. This is still my ranch too. Still my name on the partnership. I won't let him steal what we built. Martha thinks I should be careful. Says Jacob's got a temper when he's cornered. But what else can I do? A man has to stand up for what's right, even when it costs him. If you're reading this and the entry ended mid-sentence, mid-word, like someone had interrupted and he'd never returned. Silence filled the kitchen except for rain hammering the roof. Grace stared at those unfinished words, seeing her own story reflected back. Someone who'd trusted, who'd been betrayed, who tried to stand up and paid a price she was only beginning to understand. He never finished writing. Emma's voice came out barely above a whisper, because he never came home. Grace picked up the photographs again. Samuel and the woman, younger and happy, their whole lives ahead of them. Samuel and Jacob with arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. Brothers in arms before the betrayal. She examined Jacob Miller's face in the photograph. Handsome, confident, the kind of person you'd trust, like David, like the people who'd sympathize with Grace's situation while working to dismantle her life. What happened to him? Emma asked. To Samuel? Grace looked at the journal's final words, the sentence that would never finish. I think he stood up for what was right and paid for it. Understanding moved across Emma's face. Like you stood up to Dad and paid for it. Grace met her daughter's eyes. Yeah, except Samuel had more courage. He knew it was dangerous and did it anyway. They sat in candlelight while the storm raged, 70 years collapsing into nothing. Grace felt purpose settling into the hollow place defeat had carved. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about finishing what someone braver had started. The next morning came bright and scrubbed clean, the storm having passed through like a baptism. Grace woke early, mind already working through questions the journal had raised. She found Emma already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with Samuel's journal open in front of her. Couldn't sleep. Emma didn't look up from the page. This guy Samuel, he sounds like he really believed in his partner, kept giving him chances even when things didn't add up. Grace made coffee on the camp stove she'd set up, the house's electrical system a project for later. Sounds familiar. Mom always said you were too trusting. Emma turned a page. I used to think she meant you were stupid, but reading this, maybe being trusting isn't the same as being stupid. It was the closest thing to sympathy Emma had offered since Omaha. Grace didn't push it, just poured coffee and let the moment settle. There's more in the lockbox, Grace said. Documents, we should look at them. Together they spread the contents across the table. Among the papers, Grace found what she'd hoped for, the partnership agreement, dated January 15th, 1951. Formal, notarized, splitting ownership of the ranch and cattle operation, 50-50, between Samuel Garrett and Jacob Miller. But it was the margin notes that made Grace's pulse quicken. In Samuel's handwriting, penciled annotations ran down the sides of several pages. Small notations at first. Verify cattle count. JM says 247 head, but I counted 229. Then more detailed. Payment to Stockman's trust doesn't match invoice. Short about $200. The notes grew more urgent toward the end. JM refusing to show full books. Says I should focus on ranch work, let him handle business. But numbers don't add up. Money going out doesn't match income. Where is it going? And finally underlined twice, missing $8,500 over 6 months. Confronted JM today. He got angry, said I was questioning his integrity, but I know what I see. He's stealing from our partnership. Grace read the notes aloud while Emma listened. When she finished, her daughter was quiet for a long moment. So he had proof, Emma said. Jacob was stealing from him. Looks that way. And then Samuel disappeared right before he was going to expose it. According to the journal, yeah. Emma closed the journal carefully, treating it with respect it deserved. Mom, this isn't just some old mystery. If what you're thinking is true, if Jacob killed Samuel to cover up the theft, it's been 70 years. Everyone involved is probably dead. Grace thought about Martha's warning yesterday, about Cole Miller's threat. Mrs. Sykes said Jacob's grandson still lives here, owns half the county. Emma met her eyes. If you start digging into this, you're going to make enemies. Grace thought about that, about the sensible thing which was put the lockbox away and focus on rebuilding the ranch and staying out of trouble. But she also thought about Samuel's final journal entry, about a man preparing to stand up for what was right even though he was afraid. Maybe enemies are worth making if the cause is right. Emma studied her with an expression Grace couldn't quite read. Then she stood and went to her room, returning with a notebook and pen. If we're doing this, we need to be organized. She opened the notebook to a fresh page. We should make a timeline, figure out exactly what happened when. Grace felt something shift in her chest. Her daughter had just aligned herself with her for the first time since the divorce. They spent the next hour creating a timeline from the journal entries and documents. The partnership formed in January 1951. Samuel's first concerns appeared in March 52. By June 53, he documented clear evidence of theft. The final entry was October 12th, the day before Samuel planned to confront Jacob. We need to know what happened after that, Emma said, making notes. How did Jacob explain Samuel's disappearance? What did the authorities do? County records, Grace said. There must be property records, police reports, something official. That afternoon, they drove to Ashford. the county seat 40 minutes away. The courthouse was old limestone that had probably been impressive in 1920, but now just looked tired. The clerk in the records office was a woman in her 60s who looked up from her computer with practiced disinterest. Grace gave her the property address and the year she needed, 1953 to 55. The clerk's fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up digital scans of old documents. Here we go. Property seized for unpaid taxes and debts. April 1954, sold at auction to Jacob Miller. May 1954. Grace felt her jaw tighten. What were the debts? The clerk clicked through pages. Says here, outstanding business loans, unpaid supplier bills, back taxes, total of $14,000. And it sold for how much? $6,000. Jacob Miller was the only bidder. Samuel's half of a working ranch seized and sold to his partner for less than half what was owed. Grace kept her voice level. Any police reports from that time about Samuel Garrett? The clerk's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. You'd have to talk to the sheriff's office for that, but I can tell you I've lived here my whole life. The Garrett disappearance is old news. Settled business. Settled how? Emma asked. The woman looked at her, then back to Grace. Samuel Garrett ran off with partnership money. Jacob Miller reported it. Tried to keep the business going, but couldn't cover Samuel's debts. Lost the ranch in the process, but at least he tried to make it right. That's the story everyone knows. And if that's not what really happened? Grace kept her tone neutral. The clerk's face hardened. Then you'd be calling Jacob Miller a liar. That's a serious accusation against a respected family. The Millers have been pillars of this community for generations. She leaned forward. I'd be careful about spreading rumors, especially if you're new here and don't understand how things work. It was a threat wrapped in advice, and Grace recognized it for what it was. They left the courthouse with copies of the property records. In the CRV, Emma was quiet until they were back on the highway. She was protecting them. Yeah, Grace watched Prairie roll past the windows. Everyone here knows the Millers. They're not going to believe some stranger showing up with questions. So what do we do? Grace thought about the partnership agreement with Samuel's handwritten notes, about the journal ending so abruptly, about Cole Miller's warning yesterday. We find more proof, enough that even the people who don't want to believe it can't look away. Where do we look? Samuel said he hid evidence where only truth seekers will look. We found the lockbox, but I think there's more. He knew he was in danger. He wouldn't have put all his proof in one place. They drove in silence for a while. Then Emma spoke, voice quiet in a way that made Grace's chest tighten. When Mom took everything, when her lawyer made it look like you were incompetent, did you fight back? Grace's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Not enough, not the way I should have. Why not? I was tired, defeated, felt like the world had decided I was a failure. And who was I to argue? But you're fighting now for someone you never even met. Grace glanced at her daughter. Maybe it's easier to fight for someone else than for yourself. Or maybe I needed to find something worth fighting for before I remembered how. Emma nodded and went back to looking out the window, but her hand resting on the seat between them had unclenched. She wasn't angry anymore. She was thinking, processing, maybe even understanding. When they got home, Grace stood on the porch looking out at the ranch. Somewhere on this property, Samuel Garrett had hidden more evidence. A man smart enough to hide one lockbox was smart enough to create backup plans. Where would you hide something if you knew you might not survive to retrieve it? Grace said aloud. Emma came to stand beside her, somewhere permanent, somewhere that wouldn't get cleared out or torn down, even if the property changed hands. They looked at each other, the same thought arriving simultaneously. The barn foundation. The barn itself had collapsed years ago, but the foundation remained. Limestone blocks weathered to the color of old bones. Whoever had built it knew their craft. The stones fit together with precision, mortar still holding in most places despite decades of neglect. They started their search at first light the next morning, working methodically along the perimeter. Grace showed Emma what to look for: loose stones, hollow spots, places where the mortar looked newer than the rest. The work was slow and hot, the autumn sun climbing higher as morning stretched toward noon. It was Emma who found it around 11, in a section where 3 stones sat slightly recessed from the others. The mortar around them looked different, lighter in color, not as weathered. Together, they worked the stones loose. Behind them, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, was a metal tube about 18 inches long. Grace's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, rolled tight, was a document. She spread it carefully on the ground. Notarized statement, dated October 10th, 1953, 2 days before Samuel's final journal entry. I, Samuel Garrett, being of sound mind, make this statement as a matter of legal record. My business partner, Jacob Miller, has been systematically stealing from our joint cattle operation. What followed was detailed accounting. False cattle sales where Jacob kept the money, diverted payments from buyers, forged invoices showing expenses that never existed. Each allegation included dates, amounts, and names of witnesses who could corroborate. The statement concluded, should my death or disappearance occur under suspicious circumstances, I ask that authorities investigate Jacob Miller thoroughly. I have hidden copies of financial records and correspondence in multiple locations on this property. The truth is here for those willing to look. The statement was notarized by a clerk in the state capitol, someone outside Jacob's sphere of influence. Emma's voice came out breathless. This is it. This proves Jacob was stealing. It's evidence, Grace agreed, but it's circumstantial. It's Samuel's word against Jacob's, and Samuel's the one who disappeared. Also in the tube, tucked in the end, was a small folded paper. Grace opened it carefully. A hand-drawn map of the property, dated 1952. But unlike a normal property map, this one showed unusual detail. Underground water channels, mineral deposit indicators, areas marked with survey stakes. In the corner, in Samuel's handwriting, true value of the land, JM knows but won't discuss. Wiki? Grace studied the map with her architect's eye. Several areas were marked private, JM only. Jacob was surveying parts of the property without Samuel's knowledge, Grace said slowly, probably planning to claim the mineral and water rights for himself. Emma pointed to the markings. Could he do that if they were 50-50 partners? If Samuel disappeared and Jacob inherited the property, he could do whatever he wanted. Grace pulled out her phone, searched for the county assessor's information. She navigated through several screens before finding what she needed. Current ownership records for mineral and water rights on the old Garrett property. The rights had been severed from the surface property decades ago. They were held by a company called Miller Resources, LLC. Current value estimate made Grace's breath catch. $680,000. Emma stared at the phone screen, then back at her mother. The number sat there like an accusation. $680,000 in mineral and water rights that should have belonged to Samuel Garrett. Instead, they'd been registered to Miller Resources, LLC in 1954, right after the fraudulent property seizure. Jacob didn't just steal from the partnership. Grace felt cold certainty settle in her stomach. He orchestrated Samuel's disappearance to claim underground resources worth a fortune. And 70 years later, his grandson is still profiting. The company registration showed Cole Miller as principal owner. Grace traced the web of holdings, water rights across 3 counties, mineral claims on a dozen properties, most acquired during the 1950s when Jacob had been consolidating power. An empire built on theft and murder, still generating wealth for the family that had destroyed Samuel Garrett. We have to tell someone. Emma's voice carried urgency Grace recognized from the divorce, when her daughter had finally understood that her father's lawyer wasn't just being thorough, but actively dishonest. This isn't ancient history. They're still using stolen property rights. Grace thought about the county clerk's warning, about Cole Miller's threat on the porch 2 days ago. The local authorities wouldn't help. They were either bought or intimidated into protecting the Miller family legacy. There was a lawyer's office in Ashford. Rebecca something. Emma was already searching on her phone. Rebecca Chen. Her website says she takes civil rights cases and property disputes. A pause. Reviews mention she's not afraid of powerful defendants. Grace called the number, half expecting a secretary to screen her out. Instead, Rebecca Chen answered directly, her voice crisp and professional. Ms. Chen, my name is Grace Hartley. I recently bought the old Garrett Ranch in the county, and I found evidence suggesting the property was seized through fraud in 1954. The current holders of the mineral rights may have obtained them illegally. Silence on the line then. Can you come to my office this afternoon and bring whatever evidence you've found? Rebecca Chen's office occupied the second floor above a hardware store, accessed by exterior stairs that creaked under their weight. The reception area was small but organized, law books lining shelves beside framed diplomas from the University of Kansas. Rebecca herself was younger than Grace expected, early 40s with sharp eyes that tracked across the documents Grace spread on her desk. The partnership agreement, Samuel's notarized statement, the property map showing mineral deposits, the seizure records showing the fraudulent auction, Samuel's journal with its unfinished final entry, photographs of the well cap with Miller Construction stamped into the concrete. Rebecca read everything carefully, making notes in precise handwriting. 20 minutes passed in silence, except for pages turning. Finally, she sat back. This is remarkable. If authentic, and it looks authentic, this suggests significant fraud in a 1950s property seizure. Grace leaned forward. Can we do anything about it? Statute of limitations has passed on most criminal charges, but there might be grounds for a civil action regarding the property rights. If the seizure was fraudulent, subsequent transfers of mineral and water rights could be challenged. Rebecca's expression grew more intent. If you can prove Jacob Miller murdered Samuel Garrett to steal the property, the entire Miller family legacy collapses. Emma spoke up. So Cole Miller could lose everything? Everything traceable to the original theft, yes. Miller Resources LLC, their real estate holdings, possibly even the bank if we can prove it was capitalized with stolen assets. Rebecca paused. But you need more. You have motive, opportunity, documented theft. What you don't have is a proof of murder, a body, witness testimony, physical evidence linking Jacob to Samuel's death. Grace thought about the well sealed with fresh concrete bearing Jacob's company name. If we excavate the well, you need legal authority for that, police or state investigators. But the local sheriff? Rebecca shook her head. Tom Breslin's campaign was funded by Miller money. He won't help you. Then who will? State Attorney General's office. I can file a complaint, send them your evidence. They have authority to override local law enforcement. Rebecca's expression grew serious. But it takes time, weeks, maybe months to get investigators mobilized. Grace voiced the concern that had been building since Cole's visit. Cole Miller knows we found the well. What's to stop him from destroying evidence before investigators arrive? Nothing. In fact, I'd expect him to try. The words hung heavy between them. Rebecca pulled out a legal pad, began drafting language for the complaint. Grace watched her work, feeling the machinery of justice engage. Slow, bureaucratic, but finally moving in the right direction. When they left an hour later with Rebecca's promise to file the complaint that evening, Emma was quiet until they reached the CRV. We need to find more evidence before Cole destroys what's left. Grace nodded. Samuel's statement had mentioned multiple locations: the lockbox in the cellar, the notarized document in the barn foundation. Where else would a man planning for his own murder hide proof? Back at the ranch, they approached the search systematically. Grace's architectural training helped her think about spaces people overlooked, places that would survive decades of neglect. The root cellar extension off the kitchen had been on her list to clear anyway. Now she examined it with new purpose. The space was smaller than the main cellar, accessible through a low door that required ducking. Cobwebs thick as curtains draped the entrance. Emma followed with a flashlight while Grace worked her way deeper into the narrow space. The back wall showed limestone foundation like the rest of the house, but one section felt different under Grace's exploring fingers. A board that should have been flush sat slightly proud of the stones around it. She worked it loose carefully, aware that whatever lay behind had been hidden intentionally. Behind the board, tucked between foundation stones in a gap that would have been invisible unless you knew where to look, was another bundle wrapped in wax paper. Grace's pulse quickened as she pulled it free. Inside were letters, a dozen of them, all addressed to Samuel Garrett in different handwriting, but never signed. Grace carried them to the kitchen, where better light revealed their contents. The letters told a story of escalating threats, a murder planned in writing by someone too arrogant or too certain of their power to worry about evidence. June 1953. You need to stop asking questions. The business is what it is. Accept your share and be grateful. July. Your nosing around is causing problems. Some things are better left alone. Think about what you have to lose. August grew more explicit. This is your final warning. Drop your accusations or face consequences. You have a woman who cares about you. Consider her safety. September abandoned pretense entirely. Accidents happen to stubborn men. Fires, falls, disappearances. No one would be surprised if a rancher met a bad end. Grace's hands shook reading that one. Emma had gone pale beside her. The final letter was dated October 11th, 1953, one day before Samuel's last journal entry. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., the old well. Come alone if you want to settle this. Bring your evidence if you think it matters. We'll see what truth is worth. Emma's voice came out barely above a whisper. He lured Samuel to the well. Samuel went to confront him and never came home. Grace photographed every letter with her phone, uploaded them immediately to cloud storage, sent copies to Rebecca Chen. Her phone buzzed within minutes. This changes everything. These prove premeditation. I'm filing emergency complaint with AG office tonight. Do not approach the well alone. Do not confront Cole Miller. This is now a homicide investigation. But Grace knew Cole wouldn't wait for investigators. She'd seen the fear flash across his face when she'd refused to sell. A man with that much to lose wouldn't sit idle while his empire crumbled. The next morning proved her right. Grace drove to the hardware store needing roof repair supplies. The storm had revealed gaps that would only get worse as winter approached. Frank, the owner who'd been friendly during her first visit, met her at the door. Can't help you today. Grace blinked. I just need some shingles and... Can't help you. His face showed apology, but his voice stayed firm. Got a call this morning. Was advised it wouldn't be good for business to serve certain customers. Understanding hit like cold water. Cole Miller. Frank wouldn't confirm, but his expression said enough. Grace tried the feed store next. Same response. The grocery store checker who'd been warm before turned cold, processed Grace's purchase in silence. When Grace's card declined, the woman looked unsurprised. There must be a mistake. I have money in that account. You'd have to take it up with the bank, ma'am. The bank. Cole Miller's bank. Grace drove there already knowing what she'd find. The manager, the nervous man who'd approved her small business account 2 weeks ago, explained that the account had been flagged for suspicious activity. What suspicious activity? I can't discuss specifics. Until it's resolved, the account is frozen. This is Cole Miller's bank. The manager's face flushed. Mr. Miller owns the bank, yes, but these decisions are made by our fraud department following standard protocols. How long until it's resolved? Could be several days, could be longer. Grace left understanding the message. Every business in Ashford depended on Miller money. Loans, accounts, investments, political influence. Anyone who helped Grace would face consequences. Economic warfare, precise and effective. She returned home with just a can of gas for the generator. Emma waited on the porch, face worried. How bad? Grace listed it: hardware store, feed store, grocery store, bank. Her daughter's expression hardened with an anger Grace recognized. The same fury that had sustained Emma through the divorce when she'd finally seen how her father had systematically destroyed her mother's life. Can he actually do that? Just freeze your money? He owns the bank. He can do whatever he wants and justify it later. They had $3,000 cash hidden in the CRV, money Grace had kept separate in case David tried something similar during the divorce. That would last a few weeks if they were careful. But they needed to move faster, find enough evidence that state investigators couldn't ignore. Grace thought about Samuel's statement again. Multiple locations, evidence scattered across the property. The house itself remained largely unsearched. That evening, as temperature dropped and wind picked up in that way that warned of weather coming, they began a systematic examination of the interior. Emma suggested checking near the chimney where it would be warmest and driest. Grace tapped along the kitchen wall adjacent to the old stone chimney, listening for changes in sound. Most of the wall gave back a solid thunk. One section sounded hollow. She examined the plaster carefully. Original work, painted over many times, but there, barely visible if you knew what to look for, a seam. Someone had cut this section and replastered it. Grace broke through carefully, aware that whatever lay behind had survived 70 years and deserved respect. Behind the plaster, in a cavity between wall studs, sat a metal box smaller than the lockbox but sealed with the same care. Inside were financial records that made everything else look preliminary. Ledgers showing actual cattle sales versus what Jacob had reported to Samuel. The theft was methodical, consistent, averaging $1,500 per transaction. June 1952, actual sale $3,200. Jacob reported $2,000, pocketed $1,200. September, an actual sale $4,800, reported $2,400, stole $2,400. Page after page of systematic theft, each entry documented with dates and buyer names. Receipts for fake expenses, feed purchases from companies that didn't exist. Equipment repairs from Miller's own businesses, billing the partnership. Legal fees to county officials, who were clearly being paid off. Bank statements showed an account in Jacob's name only. Deposits matching the stolen amounts. Withdrawals to consulting fees and investment opportunities that Grace recognized as money laundering. The total documented theft exceeded $18,000, equivalent to nearly $200,000 today. But the smoking gun was a carbon copy of a letter from Jacob to the county clerk, dated March 1954, 5 months after Samuel disappeared. Per our agreement, attached as payment for expedited property seizure processing. The check stub showed $500 to the clerk. Jacob hadn't just killed Samuel. He'd bought the entire system that legitimized the theft. Grace photographed everything, hands moving on autopilot while her mind processed the implications. Emma stood beside her, voice tight when she finally spoke. He didn't just murder Samuel. He corrupted everyone. The clerk, the judge, the auctioneer. They all knew. The phone buzzed. Rebecca Chen, responding to the photos Grace had uploaded. I've been working with forensic accountants. This proves the entire seizure was fraudulent. If we can prove Jacob Miller murdered Samuel, every subsequent transaction is void. The mineral rights revert to Samuel's estate. Grace's mind raced ahead to the obvious question. Samuel's estate, who would inherit? That depends on whether he had a will, who his legal heirs were. We'd need to research that. But Grace, Rebecca's voice grew more urgent. If Cole realizes how close you are to unraveling everything, he won't stop at freezing your bank account. The warning came too late. Grace heard a vehicle approaching. Looked out to see Martha Sykes' old pickup pulling into the drive. The elderly woman moved with purpose despite her years, face grave. Martha didn't bother with pleasantries. My neighbor just saw trucks heading toward your property. Multiple trucks, heavy equipment. Grace felt ice settle in her stomach. Where on the property? Northeast corner, where the old well used to be. Emma was already grabbing her jacket. Grace snatched her phone, car keys, the camera she'd bought at a pawn shop in Omaha. They piled into the CRV, Martha climbing in back without asking, and Grace drove toward the well site with headlights off. Half a mile from the location, she killed the engine. They approached on foot through prairie grass tall enough to hide in. The sun had set an hour ago, but portable floodlights illuminated the well site like a stage. 3 trucks, 6 men, a cement mixer. Cole Miller stood directing operations, his voice carrying across the prairie. 2 feet thick this time. No one's getting through that without a court order and a jackhammer. And by the time they get approval, the concrete will be cured solid. One of the workers gestured at the old cap. What about the investigation you heard about? Cole's laugh carried contempt. Let them investigate. Without a body, they have nothing. Just a crazy woman's theories in a 70-year-old missing person case. Grace filmed everything. Cole's face clear in the floodlights. License plates on the trucks. Miller Construction logo on the cement mixer. Men breaking up the original 1953 cap, pouring fresh concrete over the entire well opening. The operation took 30 minutes. When they finished, the well site looked like untouched ground, smooth concrete extending 3 feet past the original cap in all directions, 2 feet thick, reinforced with rebar. Cole had been thorough. He walked the perimeter checking the work, then pulled out his phone. Grace's camera caught him clearly as he made the call. It's done. Tell the family it's handled. No one will ever prove what's down there. Then he turned, looked directly toward where Grace, Emma, and Martha hid in the darkness. I know you're out there, Miss Hartley. Grace froze, finger still on the camera button. Cole's voice carried across the prairie. And I know what you're thinking, but this well is on property I have mineral rights to. I have every legal right to seal abandoned water sources for safety. He walked closer to their position. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. By the time your investigators get their paperwork together, this'll be solid as bedrock. Good luck proving what's underneath. He climbed into his truck. Before driving away, he rolled down the window for one final shot. Oh, and Miss Hartley, your daughter's school records were flagged for residency verification issues today. Seems there's questions about whether you actually live in this district. Would be a shame if she couldn't attend public school come fall. The convoy drove away, leaving them in darkness. Emma was shaking beside Grace. Martha's breathing had gone ragged. They waited until the trucks disappeared, then approached the site. Where the original well cap had been visible, now stretched fresh concrete, smooth, featureless, hiding 70 years of secrets under modern material designed to last decades more. Emma's voice broke. He destroyed it. Now we can't prove anything. But Grace was already uploading the video to cloud storage, sending copies to Rebecca. No, he just proved everything. What do you mean? Destruction of evidence is a crime, and we have video of him doing it. The phone rang before they reached the CRV. Rebecca, her voice tight with suppressed excitement. I saw your uploads, the letters, the financial records, and now video of Cole destroying the well. This is enough. I'm meeting with State AG investigator tomorrow morning, showing them everything. Cole said without a body, we have premeditation in the threatening letters. We have motive in the financial records. We have his company's name on the original well cap, and now we have him destroying a potential crime scene on video. Rebecca paused. Grace, this isn't just a cold case anymore. This is active obstruction of justice. That changes everything. After the call ended, they sat in the CRV while Grace's pulse slowly returned to normal. Martha spoke from the back seat, her voice carrying weight they hadn't heard before. It's time I told you the whole truth. They drove to Martha's small house, the three of them crowding into her sparse living room. Martha moved with purpose now, pulling out a box from a locked cabinet Grace hadn't noticed before. I've been waiting 70 years for someone like you to come along. Someone who'd care enough to look, brave enough to fight. She set the box on the coffee table. Someone worthy of finishing what Samuel started. Inside the box, more photographs of Samuel, younger and in uniform, letters in his handwriting, and a ring, an engagement ring with a small diamond that caught the lamplight. Martha touched the ring with trembling fingers. Samuel Garrett and I were engaged in August 1953. We planned to marry that November. Grace's breath caught. Emma leaned forward. We were married October 9th, 2 days before Samuel confronted Jacob. Martha pulled out a document, unfolded it carefully. A marriage certificate, legal and notarized, dated October 9th, 1953. Martha Sykes becoming Martha Garrett. Samuel wanted me protected if something happened. We went to the state capitol, found a judge, made it legal. We were going to announce it after everything was settled with Jacob. Her voice caught. We never got the chance. The implications crashed through Grace's understanding. You're his widow. You inherited everything when he died. Legally, yes, but I couldn't claim it openly. Jacob had already started the seizure process. If I'd come forward, he would have killed me too. Martha's hands shook, but her voice stayed steady. So I hid the marriage certificate, kept my maiden name, watched from the shadows. Through trusts and shell companies, Grace said, pieces falling into place. You eventually bought the ranch back. Martha nodded. After Jacob sold it, I bought it through intermediaries. Let it sit. Let it wait. She looked at Grace. Waited for someone who'd understand betrayal. Someone who'd lost everything to someone they trusted. Someone who'd fight. Emma spoke carefully. You didn't choose my mother specifically? No, I didn't even know she existed until she'd already bought the property. Martha's expression softened. But when she came, when I saw her, a woman beaten down, trying to protect her daughter, willing to rebuild from nothing. I recognized someone who'd understand what Samuel went through. You tested us. Grace thought about Martha's warnings, the cryptic advice. I needed to know you were worthy of Samuel's trust, that you wouldn't give up when things got hard. Martha pulled out another item from the box, a cassette tape, old and fragile. Samuel gave me this the night before he died. His voice, his testimony for when the truth finally came out. And she had an old cassette player, the kind Grace remembered from childhood. Martha inserted the tape with reverent care, pressed play. Static crackled, then a man's voice filled the small living room. Samuel Garrett, speaking from October 11th, 1953, knowing he might not survive to tell his story himself. Martha, if you're hearing this, I'm gone. Jacob killed me, or I'm running scared. But either way, I want you to know what happened and why. The voice was calm, determined, touched with fear but not overwhelmed by it. A man facing death who wanted his truth preserved. Jacob Miller has been stealing from our partnership since day one. I have proof, financial records showing where the money went, threatening letters he sent when I got close to exposing him. Tomorrow morning, I'm meeting him at the old well, 6 a.m. He says we can settle this like men. I think he means to kill me. Samuel described hiding evidence across the ranch, the lockbox in the root cellar, the notarized statement in the barn foundation, financial records in the house wall. Then his voice grew softer, more personal. If I don't come back, Martha, wait. Wait for someone worthy, someone who understands betrayal, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Give them the evidence. Let them finish this. A pause, breath drawn and released. I love you. We'll have our November wedding, or I'll be waiting for you on the other side. But either way, don't let Jacob win. Don't let him prosper while I'm forgotten. Promise me, Martha. Promise. The tape ended with a click. Silence filled the room except for Martha's quiet crying. 70 years of grief finally finding release. Grace's throat was tight. You kept your promise. For 70 years, Martha wiped her eyes. Watched Jacob die an old man, respected and honored. Watched his family build an empire on what he stole. Waited for someone who'd give a damn about an old injustice. Emma spoke, her voice thick with emotion. And now we're going to finish it. Martha looked at them both. There's one more thing you should know. Cole Miller is dangerous. More dangerous than his grandfather because he has more to lose. If he realizes how close you are to destroying everything. Thunder interrupted her, close and violent. The lights flickered. Grace looked out the window to see clouds rolling in, black and heavy, moving faster than weather should move. Martha's neighbor called, voice urgent through the phone. Someone just drove past, heading toward the Hartley Ranch. 3 vehicles, they weren't from around here. Grace was already moving toward the door. Emma and Martha followed. They piled into the CRV, Grace driving faster than was safe on dirt roads while storm clouds gathered overhead. When they reached the ranch, the house sat dark and apparently empty. But Grace noticed immediately. The front door hung slightly open. She hadn't left it that way. Stay in the car. Grace reached for the hammer she kept behind the seat. Engine running. If I'm not out in 2 minutes, drive to town. Go public, safety in numbers. But Mom, do it. Grace approached the house carefully, every sense alert. The door swung open at her touch. Inside, chaos. Not vandalism, but a professional search. Drawers opened, papers scattered, walls checked for hollow spaces. Someone looking for something specific. She moved through rooms systematically. Kitchen, searched. Bedrooms, searched. Nothing taken that she could see, but everything examined. The cellar door stood open. Grace descended carefully, hammer ready. The space where she'd hidden the lockbox had been torn apart, but she'd already moved everything important. The evidence was with Rebecca, backed up in cloud storage, beyond Cole's reach. On the cellar wall, spray-painted in red, last warning. Leave or disappear like Garrett. Grace photographed it with shaking hands, then heard Emma screaming outside. She ran. In the driveway, a black SUV blocked the CRV. 2 large men stood near Emma's window. Martha sat rigid in the back seat. Get away from my daughter. Grace emerged with the hammer raised. The men turned, not threatening physically, but their presence was threat enough. The larger one spoke with calculated calm. Just delivering a message from Mr. Miller. He wants you to know the state investigators can look all they want. They won't find anything. Because there's nothing to find, just old stories and wasted time. Grace kept the hammer ready. Tell Cole I have video of him destroying evidence. Tell him state police are coming. Tell him it's over. The men exchanged glances. The smaller one spoke. Ma'am, you don't understand how things work here. The Millers built this county. Without them, half the people here would starve. You think anyone's going to side with an outsider over them? I think people will side with truth, eventually. The larger man's expression hardened. 24 hours. You have 24 hours to change your mind. After that, things get complicated. They climbed into the SUV, drove away. Emma burst from the CRV, ran to Grace, sobbing and shaking. Grace held her daughter while Martha emerged more slowly, face pale but determined. He's escalating. Martha's voice carried the weight of experience. This is what Jacob did. Economic pressure first, then intimidation, then violence. Cole learned from the best. 2 state police cars appeared at the end of the driveway, summoned by Rebecca, who'd called them the moment Grace sent the video of the break-in. The officers took statements, photographed the spray paint, documented everything. But their presence felt inadequate against the Miller family's reach. That night, none of them slept. Grace sat at the kitchen table with Emma and Martha, organizing evidence while wind howled outside and storm clouds gathered. Tomorrow, the state investigator would arrive. Tomorrow, they'd begin the formal process of excavating the well, documenting evidence, building a case that could survive legal challenges. But tonight they waited. 3 women in a farmhouse, holding secrets that could destroy an empire built on murder. Around midnight, Emma looked up from the journal she'd been reading. Mom, what if they come back tonight? What if Cole decides we're too dangerous to let live? Grace met her daughter's eyes. She thought about lying, offering reassurance that would ring hollow. Instead, she spoke truth. Then we make sure the evidence survives us. Everything's backed up. Rebecca has copies. The state AG has copies. If something happens to us, the investigation continues. She paused. But nothing's going to happen. Because Cole knows that hurting us now would only prove our case. Thunder shook the house. Lightning illuminated the prairie. And in that flash, Grace saw what she'd been half expecting. A vehicle on the ridge overlooking the ranch, headlights off, watching. Cole Miller, or someone he'd sent, waiting, calculating, deciding how far he dared go to protect what his grandfather had stolen. Grace checked the locks again, positioned her phone where she could reach it quickly, kept the hammer close. Emma dozed in fits, jerking awake at every sound. Martha sat straight in her chair, eyes distant, remembering another night 70 years ago when she'd waited for a man who would never come home. The storm broke around 3 a.m., violent, personal, like the prairie itself objecting to buried secrets being exposed. Rain hammered the roof, wind shook windows that were already broken. Lightning turned night into strobing daylight. And through it all, Grace watched the ridge where the vehicle had been. Watched and waited, and wondered if dawn would bring state investigators or something worse. Dawn came cold and clean, the storm having scrubbed the air until it hurt to breathe. Grace stood on the porch watching 2 state vehicles approach, official sedans that looked out of place against prairie backdrop. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the first car, Asian-American woman in her 50s, face weathered by years of excavating buried truths. She carried herself with the authority of someone who'd testified in federal court and won. Behind her came 3 assistants hauling equipment, ground-penetrating radar, excavation tools, evidence bags, cameras designed for forensic documentation. The second car held 2 state troopers, their presence a statement that local jurisdiction no longer applied. Rebecca Chen arrived minutes later, no relation to Dr. Chen, but united in purpose. She'd brought a court order signed by a state judge at 6 that morning, authorization to excavate, examine, and preserve whatever lay beneath Cole Miller's concrete. Dr. Chen reviewed the evidence in Martha's living room, the 4 women crowding around a table spread with 70 years of documentation. Samuel's journal, the threatening letters, financial records, the marriage certificate proving Martha's legal standing, Samuel's voice on tape, testifying from beyond the grave. When the tape finished, Dr. Chen sat back, expression grave but energized. This is one of the most thoroughly documented cold cases I've encountered. Mr. Garrett essentially conducted his own posthumous investigation. She looked at Martha. Mrs. Garrett, this must be incredibly difficult. Are you certain you want to be present for the excavation? Martha's voice came out steel wrapped in age. I've waited 70 years. I'll see it through. The excavation site transformed into something clinical and official. Yellow tape cordoned off the area. Portable generators powered lights and equipment. Dr. Chen's team worked with methodical precision, first using radar to map what lay beneath Cole's concrete. The radar operator called Dr. Chen over, pointing at the screen. Grace couldn't read the images, but saw the investigator's expression shift. There's definitely something down there. Approximately 40 feet deep. Density suggests organic material and metal objects. She looked up at the team. Let's break through. The jackhammer started at 8 a.m. Cole had poured 2 feet of reinforced concrete, but state equipment made steady progress. By noon, they'd penetrated to the original 1953 cap. Miller Construction, the stamp read, permanent accusation cast in concrete. Photographs documented everything. Samples were taken for forensic analysis. The concrete itself could be dated, linked to Miller Construction records, proved when the well was sealed. Then the original cap came apart, revealing darkness that had been sealed for 7 decades. Grace, Emma, and Martha watched from the designated observer area 50 yards back, close enough to see, far enough to not contaminate evidence. Sheriff Breslin arrived mid-morning, face rigid with barely controlled fury. He tried to assert jurisdiction, but the state troopers politely informed him he could observe or leave. Cole Miller's attorney appeared around 1 p.m., expensive suit, briefcase, entitled bearing that barely masked fear. He demanded to know what they'd found. Chen didn't look up from her work. Your client can read the public report when it's filed. Now please step back behind the tape. The excavation descended in stages. Every bucket of material was sifted, examined, cataloged. The team worked in shifts, maintaining sterile conditions as much as possible in open air. Around 4 p.m., Dr. Chen emerged from the well shaft and walked to where Martha waited. Her face was professional but kind. Mrs. Garrett, we found human remains. We'll need dental records for official identification, but we also found this. She opened an evidence bag containing a gold signet ring, tarnished but intact. The initials SG were clearly visible. Martha reached for the ring, then pulled her hand back as if the metal might burn. Her voice broke for the first time. That's Samuel's. His father gave it to him when he came back from the war. He wore it every single day. I'm very sorry for your loss. Martha's tears came silent. 70 years of grief finding release. Emma moved to support her, the 16-year-old holding the 93-year-old, while both cried for a man they'd never met, but had come to know through his careful documentation of betrayal. Grace felt her own throat constrict. This was what justice looked like, not triumphant, but necessary, painful even in victory. The excavation continued through the evening. As more evidence emerged, Dr. Chen cataloged each item with grim efficiency. Complete skeleton at the bottom of the shaft, positioned as if the body had been dropped rather than placed. Personal effects preserved by dry conditions, wallet, belt buckle, a pocket watch that matched the one Grace had found in the cellar. Both halves of the gift Samuel had given Jacob, one dropped during murder, one carried to the grave. The murder weapon came up just before sunset. A heavy pipe wrench, Miller Construction logo etched into the handle. Dr. Chen held it carefully, pointing out what looked like rust, but her trained eye recognized as something else. Blood residue, remarkably preserved in the sealed environment. We'll test it, but I'm confident it'll match the victim. She examined the wrench under portable lights. Injury pattern on the skulls consistent with this tool. Victim was struck from behind. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. Cole Miller's attorney tried one last time. You can't prove my client's grandfather committed any crime. Jacob Miller is long dead. Dr. Chen cut him off with the precision of someone who dealt with too many lawyers protecting the guilty. We can prove Jacob Miller's company sealed this well in 1953. We can prove Samuel Garrett disappeared that same year after documenting a theft and receiving death threats. We can prove the murder weapon belongs to Miller Construction. And we have video of your client destroying evidence by pouring concrete over this site 2 nights ago. She gestured to the state troopers. That's not a 70-year-old case. That's active obstruction of justice happening this week. The troopers moved toward Cole's attorney. Where's your client now? The lawyer's face went pale. I'll need to call him. Do that. Tell him we have a warrant for his arrest. Cole Miller turned himself in the next morning, arriving at the county courthouse in his Silverado with his attorney beside him. State police were waiting. The arrest happened on the courthouse steps, public and deliberate, cameras rolling, because word had spread through Ashford that something major was happening. The charges were read aloud: destruction of evidence, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to conceal a homicide, witness intimidation. Cole's face cycled through shock, anger, calculation, finally settling on fear as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. You can't do this. I'm a pillar of this community. The state trooper's voice carried no sympathy. You're under arrest, Mr. Miller. You have the right to remain silent. A small crowd had gathered, townspeople who'd lived under Miller influence for generations, watching that power crumble in real time. Grace stood at the back with Emma and Martha, bearing witness. Cole caught sight of them as he was led to the patrol car. His final outburst carried across the courthouse lawn. My grandfather built this county. He employed hundreds. So what if he had to make hard decisions? Samuel Garrett was weak. He would have failed anyway. Silence followed. Then someone started a slow clap. Not applause, but mockery of his defense. Others joined. The sound built until Cole was loaded into the car, his attorney climbing in beside him, both disappearing behind tinted windows. Sheriff Breslin announced his resignation that afternoon, citing personal reasons. Everyone understood the real cause. State investigators had found campaign finance violations, evidence of payoffs from Miller accounts, decades of looking the other way. The new interim sheriff was a woman from state police, career law enforcement with no local connections to compromise her. Her first statement set a new tone. This county is going to follow the law. All of it, for everyone. The forensic analysis took 2 weeks but confirmed what the evidence already suggested. Medical examiner's report: blunt force trauma to posterior skull, consistent with pipe wrench found at scene, death nearly instantaneous. DNA testing on bone marrow matched Martha's DNA, confirming family relationship. Dental records from Samuel's military service provided final identification. The blood on the wrench was type A positive, matching Samuel's documented blood type. Forensic dating of the concrete matched Miller Construction's 1953 formulation. Every technical detail supported what Samuel's documentation had already proved. Rebecca filed civil suit challenging the 1954 property seizure. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed Jacob had paid county clerk $500, judge $1,000, auctioneer $300, all documented in ledgers Samuel had hidden and Grace had found. The seizure had been fraudulent from inception. The debts supposedly owed were fabricated. The auction was rigged. Jacob Miller had murdered his partner, then bought the officials who would legitimize his theft. The court proceedings moved faster than Grace expected. When evidence is this clear, lawyers have nothing to argue except procedure. Cole's attorney tried delaying tactics, filing motions about statute of limitations and legal standing. Rebecca demolished each argument. The original fraud makes every subsequent transaction void. The 1954 seizure was obtained through conspiracy and murder. My client, Martha Garrett, is the legal widow and sole heir of Samuel Garrett. The property, the mineral rights, the water claims, all of it reverts to her estate. The judge, a federal appointee with no local connections, ruled in Martha's favor. The decision was comprehensive and damning. The court finds that Jacob Miller murdered Samuel Garrett on or about October 13, 1953. The property seizure of 1954 was procured through fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. All subsequent transfers of property, mineral rights, and water claims are hereby voided. Assets revert to the estate of Samuel Garrett, represented by his widow, Martha Garrett. The Miller empire collapsed like a house built on sand. Miller Resources LLC was dissolved, assets frozen pending distribution. The bank was seized by federal regulators. Real estate holdings throughout the county were examined for connections to the original theft. Anything traceable to those 1954 assets was subject to forfeiture. The town of Ashford faced its own reckoning. For 70 years, they'd honored Jacob Miller's name. Miller Memorial Park, Miller Elementary School, the Miller Wing of the county hospital, all named for a murderer, all built with stolen wealth. The city council voted to remove his name from public property. Miller Memorial Park became Garrett Memorial Park. A plaque was installed telling the real story, how Samuel Garrett had documented theft, stood for truth, and paid with his life. How his widow had waited 7 decades for justice. High school history classes were revised. The official narrative that Samuel had run away was corrected. Students learned about systemic corruption, about how power protects itself, about ordinary people who refuse to let injustice stand. Truth, delayed for 70 years, finally entered the official record. Martha wanted Samuel's funeral on November 15th, the date they'd planned to marry in 1953. Grace helped arrange everything, finding a balance between Martha's desire for simplicity and the reality that this was a public moment, a community acknowledgement of wrong. The service was held at the ranch, Samuel buried on the eastern slope overlooking the prairie he'd loved. 200 people came, far more than Grace expected. Descendants of the witnesses Samuel had named in his notarized statement, people who'd always questioned the official story but lacked power to challenge it. Strangers moved by the tale of evidence hidden and truth preserved. Martha stood before the casket, frail but unbroken, and spoke the words she'd waited 70 years to say publicly. Samuel Garrett was a good man. He believed in fairness, in justice, in doing the right thing even when it cost him everything. He was stolen from me by someone who chose greed over honor. But Samuel prepared. He knew he might not survive, so he created insurance. Evidence scattered across this property, waiting for someone brave enough to find it. She looked directly at Grace. Ms. Hartley came to this ranch desperate and broken. She found more than shelter. She found purpose. She finished what Samuel started. She gave him justice. She gave me peace. Martha's voice strengthened, carrying across the assembled mourners. Today we lay Samuel to rest, not as a thief who ran away, not as a footnote in someone else's story, but as a man who stood for truth, who documented everything, who trusted that someday someone would care enough to look. She placed a single rose on the casket. Rest now, my love. Our November wedding was delayed 70 years, but we're together now, and the truth is finally told. The casket was lowered into Kansas soil. Grace stood with Emma on one side, Rebecca on the other, watching Martha fulfill a promise that had sustained her through 7 decades of waiting. When it was done, Martha looked smaller somehow, as if justice accomplished had taken the last of her strength. 6 weeks later, on a December morning when snow fell soft across the prairie, Martha passed in her sleep. She was 93, had lived to see every goal accomplished. Samuel properly buried, his name cleared, justice served. The ranch she'd protected through shell companies and patient waiting was secure in Grace's hands. Martha's will was brief and clear. Everything, the ranch, the mineral rights, the settlement from the Miller estate, went to Grace Hartley. One condition: the property must always be called Garrett Hartley Ranch, honoring the man who built it and the woman who saved it, the will specified. Martha left a personal note in a sealed envelope, opened after her death. Dear Grace, I didn't choose you. Fate did. But I recognized in you what Samuel had: integrity that couldn't be bought or intimidated. Use this gift to build something honest. Raise your daughter with the values Samuel died defending. Remember, truth delayed is not truth denied. With gratitude, Martha. Grace read the letter in Martha's empty house, Emma beside her, both crying for the second time in 2 months. The funeral was smaller, more intimate. Martha had outlived most of her generation. But Grace made sure Samuel's name was on the headstone beside Martha's. Samuel Garrett, 1922-1953, beloved husband, honest man. Martha Garrett, 1931 to 2024, beloved wife, faithful heart. Truth delayed is not truth denied. Winter passed into spring. The ranch transformed under Grace's careful attention. She used part of the settlement money to hire local contractors, people who'd lost work when the Miller businesses collapsed, grateful for employment that didn't require compromising their integrity. The house received a new roof first, then windows, siding, fresh paint in colors that matched the photographs from 1952. Grace preserved original details wherever possible. The hand-fitted limestone foundation, the craftsman woodwork, the stone chimney that had hidden evidence for 70 years. The barn was rebuilt using the original frame where it was salvageable. Grace designed the restoration herself, architectural drawings that honored the structure's history while making it functional for modern use. She converted part of it into an office for the architecture practice she was restarting. Hartley Restoration Architecture, the sign read, specializing in historic preservation. Her first client was the city of Ashford, asking her to restore the old courthouse. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The building where corrupt officials had legitimized Samuel's stolen property, now being restored by the woman who'd exposed that corruption. Grace approached the work with professional distance but personal satisfaction. She uncovered original details that had been covered in cheap 1970s renovations. She traced the building's history, documented its architectural significance, made recommendations for preservation that honored its past while making it functional for the future. The project brought steady income and led to others. A historic theater in the county seat, a Victorian mansion being converted to a museum, a Depression-era school building slated for demolition until Grace showed the city council how restoration could cost less than replacement while preserving community history. The mineral rights provided passive income, $40,000 per year from a legitimate mining company that leased the extraction rights. Grace set most of it aside for Emma's education. Her daughter had been accepted to Kansas State's engineering program with a full academic scholarship, planning to specialize in sustainable architecture. "So I can work with you after graduation," Emma explained one evening over dinner in the restored ranch kitchen. "Build things that matter, make things that last." Grace's relationship with David evolved into something civil, if not warm. He visited twice, saw what Grace had built from nothing, met the community that had come to respect her. His new wife was pleasant enough, their discomfort with prairie isolation obvious but polite. David's second visit came with an apology Grace hadn't expected. "I handled the divorce badly. Let my lawyer push things too far." He looked around the ranch, taking in the restoration, the thriving practice, the daughter who'd gone from resentful to grounded. "Seems like maybe you didn't need what I thought you needed." Grace accepted the apology but didn't dwell on it. That was old business, settled in its own way. The architecture firm in Omaha still bore David's name, still generated revenue for his new life. Grace had built something different here, smaller, more meaningful, entirely her own. One year after buying the ranch for $1, Grace stood on the porch watching sunset paint the prairie gold and crimson. The sign at the property entrance had been installed that morning. Garrett Hartley Ranch, Esterin 1951. Restored 2024. Emma joined her, bringing 2 mugs of coffee. They sat in comfortable silence, mother and daughter who'd survived betrayal and found purpose on the other side. "You know what Professor Martinez said when he read my admission essay?" Grace looked at her daughter. "He said integrity is a lost art, and watching someone fight for truth, even when it costs them everything, that's the most important education anyone can have." Emma paused. "He said I'm lucky to have a mother who showed me that." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm lucky to have a daughter who stood with me. Even when you were angry at first, even when staying would have been easier, you stood anyway. That's courage." The October evening was perfect, temperature dropping as stars emerged. Grace thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a Walmart parking lot at 2 a.m. to a restored ranch worth over $1 million. From sleeping in a car to building a practice that mattered. From broken to whole, not because the wounds had healed, but because she'd found purpose that made the scars worthwhile. A car appeared on the access road. Grace tensed reflexively before recognizing Rebecca Chen's sedan. The lawyer had become a friend over the months, someone who understood what it cost to stand against power. Rebecca climbed the porch steps carrying a bottle of wine and news. Cole Miller was sentenced today. 5 years federal prison for obstruction of justice. The judge made specific mention of him destroying a crime scene to protect his family legacy. Emma raised her coffee mug. To justice, even when it's 70 years late. They drank to that, the three of them watching stars emerge over prairie that had kept secrets for 7 decades. Rebecca had more news. I got a call yesterday from a woman in Colorado, Jessica Torres. She thinks something similar happened to her grandmother in 1968. Business partner fraud, suspicious disappearance, official story that never added up. She found documents hidden in the family home, a journal that ends mid-sentence. Grace met Rebecca's eyes, understanding what was being offered. You want me to help her? I think you're uniquely qualified. You know what to look for, how to organize evidence, how to stand against people who've spent decades protecting lies. Rebecca paused. Samuel's case is getting national attention. People are realizing their own family stories might not be what they were told. There are probably dozens of cases like this, hidden evidence waiting for someone who cares enough to look. Grace thought about that, about the satisfaction of finishing what Samuel started, about Martha's 70-year wait finally rewarded, about the possibility of helping others find the same resolution. I'd need to balance it with my practice, with being here for Emma. I know, I'm not suggesting you become a full-time investigator. Just that when cases like this surface, when someone reaches out desperate for help understanding their family's buried truth, maybe you could consult, share what you learned. Emma spoke up. Do it, Mom. You're good at this. You care about it. And honestly, watching you fight for Samuel, that taught me more than anything Dad's money could have bought. Grace considered. Her practice was stable, providing steady income. Emma was leaving for college in 8 months. The ranch ran itself now, winter approaching meaning less outdoor work required. She'd have time. More than that, she'd have purpose beyond just survival. A way to honor what Martha and Samuel had taught her, that truth matters, that justice can wait but shouldn't have to, that ordinary people can defeat entrenched power if they refuse to give up. Tell Ms. Torres to send me what she's found. I'll take a look. Rebecca smiled. I already gave her your number. She's overnighting documents tomorrow. They sat on the porch as temperature dropped and darkness deepened. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other, lonely and wild. The prairie stretched endless in all directions, holding its own secrets, offering its own possibilities. Grace's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Ms. Hartley, my name is Jessica Torres. Rebecca Chen gave me your contact. I found my grandmother's journal. It ends October 1968, mid-sentence right before she was going to confront her business partner about theft. She disappeared the next day. Everyone said she ran away. But I found letters hidden in her house. Threats, just like in the news stories about Samuel Garrett. Can you help me? Grace looked at the message, then at Emma, then at the ranch that had given her everything when she had nothing. She typed back, yes, tell me everything. Because this was what mattered now, not the money or the property or even the restoration of her own life, but the chance to give others what Martha had given her. Purpose, direction, the knowledge that standing up for truth, even truth buried for decades, was always worth the cost. The ranch lights glowed warm against prairie darkness. Inside, walls that had hidden evidence now protected new beginnings. The cellar that had concealed Samuel's lockbox now stored Grace's architectural drawings. The barn that had sheltered livestock now housed drafting tables and restoration plans. Everything transformed, but nothing forgotten. The past honored, the present built on foundations that would last. Emma stood to go inside, paused at the door. You know what the best part is? Not the money or the house, or even justice for Samuel, though all that matters. Grace waited. The best part is watching you become who you were supposed to be all along. Before Dad. Before the divorce. Before you forgot that you were someone worth fighting for. Emma went inside, leaving Grace alone with stars and prairie and the weight of words that landed like grace. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, broken, defeated, invisible, sleeping in a car because she'd run out of places to fall. That Grace had bought a ranch for $1 because she had no other options. This Grace sat on a restored porch, running a thriving practice, preparing to help strangers find their own buried truths. This Grace had a daughter who respected her, a community that valued her work, a purpose that went beyond mere survival. The transformation hadn't come from money or property or even justice served. It had come from refusing to give up when giving up would have been easier, from standing with Martha and Samuel against power that seemed unbeatable, from finishing what a braver person had started 70 years ago. Truth delayed is not truth denied. Martha had chosen those words for her headstone, and Grace understood why. Justice might take decades, might require patience and pain, and people who died before seeing resolution. But truth waited. Truth survived. Truth found its way to light if someone cared enough to dig. Grace pulled out her phone, began drafting an email to Jessica Torres, asking for specifics, what documents existed, what the official story claimed, who held power in her grandmother's town. Building the foundation for another investigation, another fight against lies that had stood too long. The work would be hard. The powerful would resist. There would be threats, intimidation, attempts to make her give up or go away. Cole Miller's final words as he was arrested echoed in her memory. His grandfather had built the county, employed hundreds, made hard decisions. But those hard decisions included murder, theft, corruption that had rotted an entire community for generations. And Grace had learned something this year that she'd carry forward into every battle. Sometimes the hardest decision is the right one. Sometimes standing alone against power is the only choice worth making. Somewhere out in the darkness, beyond where porch light reached, two graves rested side by side. Samuel and Martha, together at last, their story finally told, their truth finally honored, their wait finally over. Grace raised her coffee mug toward those graves, a silent toast to the people who'd given her more than property. They'd given her purpose. Tomorrow she'd start helping Jessica Torres. Tomorrow she'd meet with the County Historical Society about documenting Samuel's story. Tomorrow she'd review blueprints for the theater restoration and make calls about Emma's college housing. But tonight belonged to gratitude, for second chances, for buried evidence that waited patiently to be found, for the understanding that sometimes you have to dig through someone else's tragedy to excavate your own strength. The prairie wind picked up, carrying scents of autumn turning toward winter. Inside the house, Emma was probably video chatting with college friends, planning her future with the confidence of someone who'd watched her mother rebuild from nothing. Grace sat until the cold drove her inside, until stars filled the sky so completely they seemed close enough to touch. She locked the door, habit now rather than fear, and walked through rooms she'd restored with her own hands. In her bedroom, the one she'd scrubbed clean that first terrible day, Grace looked out at the ranch that had saved her by giving her something worth saving. The barn where evidence had hidden for 70 years. The prairie that had witnessed murder and kept secrets until someone brave enough to listen had arrived. She thought about the question Emma had asked weeks ago. Was it worth it? Everything they'd been through, everyone they'd fought, everything they had risked. A year ago, Grace had owned $11,000 and a car. Tonight, she owned a ranch, a thriving practice, her daughter's respect, and the knowledge that she could stand against injustice and win. Yeah, it was worth it. She turned off the light, let darkness settle around her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fights, new opportunities to prove that truth mattered more than power. But tonight she slept without nightmares, without fear, without the weight of defeat crushing her chest. She slept in a home she'd built, on land she'd earned, surrounded by proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things if they just refused to give up. Outside, the sign swayed gently in prairie wind. Garrett Hartley Ranch. Two names, two stories, two people who'd stood for truth when standing would have been easier to abandon. The ranch that cost $1 had given back more than money could measure. It had given Grace herself.